Not quite. Go.
Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY Graduate Center. And we're here this evening to discuss a book, a biography, a terrific biography of Newt Gingrich. This is going to be, I guess, our third or fourth virtual event since the pandemic hit. And we have 10 more coming up, already scheduled, planned. Please look at our website. Just enter Leon Levy Center for Biography and you'll find it. And there are plenty of more events coming up. The next one is on August 6th, Hiroshima Day. And we have a biographer, Nancy Greenspan, who will be talking with me about her biography of an atomic spy. So that's very appropriate. But tonight I'm pleased we have Julian Zelizer, who I first encountered some 10 years ago when he wrote this book on Jimmy Carter, a short biography. And I'm particularly interested in that book because I too, of course, am a biographer, and I've just finished my own long account of Jimmy Carter's career as a politician, president, which will be coming out next year. But Julian is extremely prolific. He is the professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University and a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He is the author and editor of 21 books, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, which came out in 2015, and Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974, co-authored with Kevin Cruz. His new book, which we'll be discussing tonight, is Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party. He also co-hosts a popular podcast called Politics and Polls. He will be interviewed virtually by Michael Tomasky, who is a special correspondent for the Daily Beast, the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Michael's most recent book, If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved, was published in paperback in June of this summer. So I want to thank also Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for sponsoring these events. She's been doing so for 13, going on 14 years now, and we're very grateful for her support. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Michael Tomasky, who will interrogate Julian about Newt Gingrich. I hope everyone who's in attendance has a stiff drink because you may need it to digest Newt Gingrich. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event, and I'm pleasantly surprised by this new Zoom culture. Although we're now on Crowdcast, I should say, Crowdcast Zoom. It makes it very easy for people to participate, and we have, I think, over 300 people for this event. So it's a new universe. Anyway, take it away, Michael. It's all yours.
Okay. Good evening. I want to thank Kai and the Center for asking me to do this. I'm very privileged to do it. Julian and I actually did a book event together last year when my last book, which Kai mentioned, came out around the same time as Julian's last book. How he got another book out so fast, I'm tempted to make that my first question. But let's move on to official business. So Julian and I will converse maybe till about 6:40, 6:45. Then we'll take questions, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions of yours, and we hope you formulate them. So let's go, Julian. Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for doing this. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. Okay, so my first question is a simple and open-ended one. Why did you write this book? And I want to fine-tune the question a little bit in this way to give people the right impression of the book. It's not a life biography of Newt Gingrich. It's not even a full political biography of Newt Gingrich. It pretty much covers 10 years of his life, a little bit more than that. So why that focus, and why this structure?
Well, I'm actually going to answer your question that you didn't just say, in terms of, I got this out because I had written much of this before the last book. And so I had started this book in the early 2010s. I was interested in part because I thought Newt Gingrich was a key figure in the conservative movement. We focused so much attention on Ronald Reagan, on the presidency, or on the grassroots movement. We didn't have a feel for how did this play out in Congress, and what was the role of that generation of Republicans. So I wanted to figure out a way to capture him, what he did, and why Republicans ultimately embraced his style of partisanship. The second is I wanted to understand, the question of polarization, or the question of why the Republicans moved so far to the right, through an actual person and a moment. We tend to talk about the big factors, whether it's voters sorting themselves or the way the media is transformed, and I do this as well, that I wanted to start writing a narrative history of how Washington ended up this way. And then finally, I was watching politics when Obama was in office and the Tea Party came to town in 2011 after the midterms, and was extraordinarily aggressive in what they were willing to do to basic procedures of government, like the budget, or what they were willing to say with the birther. And I wanted to understand, how did we end up from the Nixon era right through this as the new normal? And so all of those were part of how I ended up writing this story.
Yeah, all really interesting. Let's start with the milieu that produced Gingrich. The Georgia of the 1970s was undergoing some pretty dramatic political changes, big shifts by the two parties. Because after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you had a lot of new black voters. The Democratic Party embraced those voters and changed, and the Republican Party did something else. But just talk a little bit about the politics of Georgia and the South broadly in the 1970s, if you would.
No, that's a great question. The state is changing pretty dramatically. Gingrich had come to Georgia, by the way, as something of a transplant. His family's actually from outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He spent a lot of time in Europe as an army brat, moving around. And he only arrives in the 1950s. He goes to Emory before getting his PhD. And two things are happening. I think for the Democratic Party, the impact of the 1960s is changing what it means to be a Democrat. And the person who Gingrich runs against twice and loses in 74 and 76 is Congressman John Flint, who's an old-style conservative Democrat, pretty regressive on racial issues, and also a Democrat much more comfortable in a rural district. And I think the impact of the Voting Rights Act and the influx of African-American elected officials and more progressive voices in the party, even in Georgia, was really starting to change. Where could Flint be in a national party like this? And for Republicans, it was creating an opportunity. They were, like Gingrich, part of the Southern strategy. He was literally one of the people that's being talked about to capitalize on these changes and to play to the conservative electorate that was no longer going to vote for a Democrat. And finally, it's also becoming much more suburban, and a lot of businesses sprouting up in the 6th District. And I think the kind of demand for low taxes, less regulation, merges with some of the conservative social sentiment of the period and creates this window for the Newt Gingriches of this era.
And yet, as you point out, and you paint a really nice picture of this, in his first two failed runs in 1974 and 76, and his first one in particular, Gingrich ran as a Rockefeller Republican.
Yes. So Gingrich in the 60s through, I'd say, his first run, really, 74, he thinks of himself as a Rockefeller Republican. He admires Richard Nixon very much pre-Watergate. He believed that the Republican Party should become a grand coalition, kind of like what FDR did during the New Deal. And he also, at least rhetorically, says he wants to embrace African-American voters and create a party that can house many different constituencies. By 1975, though, right before his second run, he's already starting to change his tune, and he starts to meet up with this new conservative movement. And the story I have in the book is he meets Paul Weyrich, who's one of the real key activists of this decade, who runs a camp for up-and-coming Republican candidates where he trains them on how to run. And he has these sessions. He does one in Wisconsin that Gingrich attends. And this is where Gingrich starts to move away from that old Newt Gingrich and starts to become enamored with this group of activists and some of the broader ideas that the conservative movement was embracing. And he introduces some of this in 78 when he runs for Flint's open seat.
Mm-hmm. And so he runs, finally wins, third time. He gets to Congress. Georgia has a congressional delegation at the time of, I can't remember the number, you'll know it. He's the only Republican. And in fact, he's not the first Republican elected to the House of Representatives from Georgia since Reconstruction. He's actually the fourth. I checked this out. But the other three were elected in the 60s and served very briefly. So he gets to a delegation of all Democrats, a lot of them pretty conservative, though. And just how did he fit in his state delegation at that point?
Well, on many political issues, he wasn't so far off from where the established Democrats were. But in terms of the party, this is the Georgia Democrats, like the Massachusetts Democrats, consider themselves the party that controlled Congress. They had controlled the House and Senate since 1955. And the idea of having a Republican in the delegation was kind of odd into the history of Georgia, but also not something they were particularly open to in terms of the tenor of the House of Representatives. They, like many Republicans and Democrats at the time, all also saw him as something of a brash upstart. He comes in 79, and he has no interest in being quiet. He's not going to be the quiet young member of the delegation. So not only is he a Republican, he's not willing to wait. And within a year, he's making a name for himself in the press. So they have some of the same discomfort that many legislators are going to have about what he's doing.
Yeah. So as you say, he's making a lot of noise and making headlines from the start and drawing attention to himself. I mean, he perceives of politics very differently than the Depression War generation perceived of politics.
Yes, very much. One big difference is he's not someone who waits, and he's not someone who really cares about committee work. So he's not entering like many in that generation did, saying, I will wait through the seniority process. I'll do my work. I'll focus on legislation and committee negotiation, and ultimately I'll move up in the leadership. He has a time span that's a few years in his mind of when he's going to make a name for himself. And what he focuses on is the media. He instantly sees that changes in the media, whether it's cable or investigative journalism or even network television, offer opportunity for a legislator who's willing to be brash to get their name out, to get their message out right away. And he's also, I'd say, less willing to balance his partisanship with some of the other interests that older generation, even the tough partisans, still thought important. The need to govern, in the end, to accomplish legislative outcomes, or the need just to protect the long-term sanctity of the institutions they were working in. These were ideas most leaders ultimately embraced. He had no interest in any of that. And so within a year, he goes right to work to make a name for himself.
Yeah. So let's go to the like the first big set piece of his career, the first scandalous moment when he deeply offended Tip O'Neill with something that he did on the floor. Why don't you tell people that story?
Yeah, so this is the story of Cam Scam, where he makes a name for himself, and he capitalizes on reforms that Democrats had enacted in the late 70s after Watergate. And in 1978, the House, for the first time, had allowed television cameras to cover what was going on the floor, which was a big deal. Congress had always been very insular, very secretive. And they say, well, we have to throw sunshine. And so they allow the camera to cover the person speaking. A year later, a network called C-SPAN comes on the air. And by the early 80s, when Gingrich is coming into office, this is part of the cable packages that Americans are starting to buy in larger numbers. And so he says, what a channel. With this channel, if I could get on, I can launch my attacks on the Democrats, and I can speak directly to the people, because there's no journalists on C-SPAN. The whole idea of the network was just to give you unfiltered politics. So in 1984, he and a group of Republicans in something called the Conservative Opportunity Society, a group he created,
Tomasky.
they go on air at the end of every day. They go on the floor and they make these really aggressive speeches about Democrats. And anyone's allowed to make a speech at the end of the day. And they would call Democrats weak on defense. They read from this long study of the party that basically said Democrats don't care about protecting this country. They attacked Democrats for not supporting Ronald Reagan's war in Central America against communism. And the speeches got so bad because at the end they were attacking specific legislators, and they were calling on legislators, Democrats, to respond to these charges that they were essentially unpatriotic. If you were watching on C-SPAN, all you saw was a Newt Gingrich saying this about someone, and no one responded because you couldn't see that the chamber was completely empty at the end of the day. And at one point, he attacks Eddie Bolin. The Republicans attack a congressman who was a friend of Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House. And O'Neill gets so mad, he comes into the chamber and he asks the cameraman to pan the chamber to show this is all just a big political ruse. And he does that. And Gingrich instantly turns this against Speaker O'Neill. And he and his colleagues say, look, Tip O'Neill breaks the rules. He's not supposed to let the camera pan the chamber. He's an autocrat. He's tyrannical. He's everything we say about him. And then they continue with these speeches. And it gets even worse. A few days later, O'Neill finally comes to the floor and he says this is the lowest thing he's seen in his career in American politics, and basically says this is a new McCarthy we have on our hands. And even that, they then insist, the Republicans, that the remarks be stricken from the record because they were not legitimate for a speaker to talk about another member that way. This all culminates at the end of all of this when the three networks cover this, and they cover this Cam Scam scandal, and they cover Gingrich and his group of renegade Republicans. And that's in many ways what he wanted. Not only did he get out these attacks against Democrats, but he made himself a national presence because the news covered the conflict. And he said, I know that it's conflict and confrontation that ultimately will draw the attention of the media.
So he was, for better or worse, he was like the first guy to sort of figure that out, right?
He was a C-SPAN politician. He says this at one point of his career.
Yeah. So let's proceed to Jim Wright. Gingrich's attacks on Jim Wright are the gist of the book. So just start by telling people who Jim Wright was.
He's an old school Texan who was very much shaped by the New Deal and parts of the Great Society. He was someone who came into office in the 1950s, and he was the opposite of Gingrich. He was a wait your turn, learn the system, learn the process, and move up the ladder kind of legislator. He was someone not well liked personally. Even Democrats who thought he was a good politician didn't like him. A lot of his friendships really resided back in the district, in the Fort Worth area. And in 1976, he became the majority leader unexpectedly. Democrats vote for a new majority leader, and basically the party splits over two reform-oriented legislators, Richard Bolling and Phil Burton, who were very much more post-Watergate Democrats. And because they split the vote, he ends up winning it. So it's kind of unexpected. He serves as majority leader for 10 years, and when Tip O'Neill retires in '86, he becomes the speaker. That's how the process works. And he was a very effective legislator. He was a very tough partisan by the mid-1980s. He believed he was holding back the Reagan Revolution in the House of Representatives, and he could be tough with Republicans. He also, though, very much loved Congress and believed in the job of legislating and in the process of being part of this institution. And we can talk. He also had stories in the press about him that raised questions about some of his business relationships and some of his own ethical practices that become the heart of the scandal.
And let's just set up the context a little further. Tell people who the Republican leader of the House was at the time, and also talk a little bit about the ideological makeup of those days. Now today, and they measure this, National Journal and other people measure this, there is no crossover in the two delegations in the House of Representatives. That is to say, the most liberal Republican is still more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. There's space in between the two parties, but that wasn't at all the case in the 1980s. So talk about the minority leader and that whole context of how the politics was back then.
So the minority leader is this guy, the House Minority Leader, Bob Michel from Illinois, and he's the other foil in the story. It's Gingrich against Speaker Wright, but it's also Gingrich against the Republican leadership. And he is a conservative on most economic issues, but Michel is heading a party that still has a somewhat liberal wing to it. The Republicans had this liberal northeastern wing of the party, which on many issues, including social issues, it wouldn't even have a role in today's party. It would find absolutely no home given where the party has moved, but it was still a presence. There was that Rockefeller tradition in the party. So Bob Michel is someone within the GOP who believes he has to negotiate the Midwestern Republicans who are more conservative and this northeastern wing of the GOP. Michel was also an institutionalist. He was someone who had spent a lot of time in Congress and believed even if Republicans were the minority, they ultimately had to participate in governing. They were going to have to work with Democrats. They were going to have to negotiate with Democrats. They were going to be careful about what they did because they would have to come back into the room with those Democrats to try to find deals. And his real kind of objective was to make sure Republicans were not kicked away and left outside the room where the decisions were made, and to do everything possible so the Democratic leaders still got their input. So he was very different temperamentally and in terms of his vision of the party than Gingrich. Yeah.
I believe the New York Times headline on his obituary, which was quite recent because he lived into his 90s, was something about conciliatory deal maker or something along those lines. And very well liked. I mean, I'd say I said how Wright was not particularly liked personally. Michel was, even by most Democrats. Yeah. He was an institutionalist is the way to think about him. Someone loyal to Congress as much as his constituency. And so, people still, they think very, very well of what he did. Yeah. So Gingrich has his sights set on toppling Jim Wright. So how did that process start? What was the Achilles heel that set this in motion? Well, he had been building the argument before Wright was really in his sights, meaning Gingrich's basic argument from 74 when he first runs through 1987 is the main argument that was going to get Democrats was a corruption, anti-establishment argument, not a left-right, conservative, liberal. It was really that Democrats were the embodiment of this
politics that Americans came to hate after the 1960s and early 70s. And so he even went after Speaker O'Neill with the same kinds of arguments. He was a tyrant. He was corrupt. The party didn't follow any sort of process or democratic rules. And then Wright becomes Speaker, and he's almost perfect. He was almost cast for the argument that Gingrich had laid out. And one thing that is important about Wright is he is not comfortable in this new world of media and this emerging world of partisanship. He very much he didn't even like to appear in front of the television cameras. He would do interviews and he wouldn't let reporters take notes. He thought that was how politics could still work. And he had these stories that a group of investigative journalists in Washington and in Texas had worked on that raised initial questions about different parts of his career. One was a business investment company that he, Jim Wright, and his wife, Betty, had created with a guy named George Malik, who was a real estate developer back in Fort Worth. And they did investments in different oil properties. And there was nothing illegal about this, didn't violate the ethics rules that the House had put into place, but stories were coming out that asked, like, what was this about? And why did Malik want this relationship? And the second story that stuck, there were many stories, was turned out Jim Wright published a small book primarily of speeches, and he sold them in bulk whenever he would speak to large groups, whether at a university or a union like the Teamsters or a trade association. And the ethics rules prohibited members of Congress from earning too much in terms of speaking fees. There was a cap to how much you could earn going around speaking. But you could earn all you wanted with book royalties. And so a guy named Charles Babcock in the Washington Post published the first story about this. And those two stories, which weren't Watergate, they were kind of pushing the boundaries of House ethics rules. This was what Gingrich honed in on to make his case that, as he used to say, Jim Wright is the most corrupt speaker in American history.
Yeah. And then Wright was a victim of a little bit of fake news in the form of one piece that you report got a lot of stuff wrong. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is Gingrich promotes these stories. He literally carries around a binder and he'd give out clippings. This is a clipping age, no internet, to reporters saying, look deeper. And he'd give them the fellow members of Congress saying, look at who's leading our institution. But then there were other stories, including one about an oil investment that Wright allegedly made that had relations to what he was doing as majority leader. Turned out it wasn't true. And Gingrich even put this story forth when he's launching in front of the press the accusations and knows at the time it's not true. And he admits it. But he kind of throws everything out there to try to create the aura of corruption.
So how long did it take, say, from those first stories by Babcock in the Washington Post until the ultimate downfall?
So the stories they're out in some are out before he becomes speaker. You can already find them in the press, and there's some reporters who are raising questions when Democrats make him the speaker. Is this really the right guy for the new Watergate accountability era of American politics? By 87, they're starting to come out. The Wall Street Journal is publishing a lot of them. A journalist named Brooks Jackson, who is famous actually for a Jimmy Carter story that he published about a killer bunny that attacked the president. But he's a money and politics reporter. So he's covering a lot of this. The Washington Post, a guy named Dave Montgomery, who wrote back in Texas, he was putting these out. And it's in the spring of 1988. So it takes some time when the pressure finally reaches the point that Common Cause, which is a good government organization in Washington that came out of the Watergate period, they call for investigation by the Ethics Committee. And they say there's enough there in these stories to at least look, is there anything we need to be worried about? And that triggers an Ethics Committee investigation that has its first stage, which is just to say, is there enough to go to a really formal look at this guy? it all culminates in the summer of 1989. Wright will ultimately resign in May. So between 87 and May 1989, Speaker Wright is living with this as he's trying to be the head of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, and Gingrich is rising in the Republican Party?
He is, although he doesn't have a leadership role until the very end of
Right.
the story. What's happening is more Republicans are starting to speak like Newt. And one person who does this is Bob Michel. So even though in public he distanced himself from Newt Gingrich, he says this is not the kind of person we want at the top of the party, he and other top Republicans and rising Republicans like Dick Cheney are putting out reports and talking to the press using the exact same language as Gingrich, really focusing in on the corruption of the Democratic majority. George H.W. Bush, in his 1988 campaign, under the advice of Lee Atwater, who's a notorious political consultant, he starts talking about Jim Wright and how corrupt he is during the presidential campaign against Michael Dukakis. And finally, in 1989, House Republicans have an open position in the leadership, House Minority Whip, when Dick Cheney, who was the whip, becomes Secretary of Defense. And there's a contest between Gingrich and a guy named Ed Madigan, who was a protege of Bob Michel, also a get-along establishment, keep the institution healthy Republican, and Gingrich wins the vote. A narrow vote, but he wins the vote. And so by the time Jim Wright resigns, Gingrich is officially part of the Republican leadership.
And by this time, Gingrich has been in the House 10 years now, and the Republican Party is a pretty different party than the party it was in 1979, the Congressional Republican Party.
Right. So Gingrich, some of the arguments he was starting to toy with in 78 about, massive supply side tax cuts and deregulation and simply an anti-government ethos combined with a family values argument, which many found ironic that Gingrich was part of that. That is becoming really the norm for a lot of the younger members who are coming in the 80s and see Ronald Reagan as this transformative president. So by the time Gingrich becomes House Minority Whip, the GOP is not what it used to be. And that old liberal Northeastern wing is almost vanished from the party. So it's moved right, it's moved to the South. And it has a much harder edge to its conservatism.
Yep. So this is beyond the scope of the book, but I think people would nevertheless be interested in hearing you talk about these things. 1994, Bill Clinton is the president, and the Democrats still control the House, as they had since the 1950s. And 94, of course, was the big election when the Gingrich-led Republicans got 54 seats and took over the majority in the House for the first time in 40 years. And that was the year of the contract with America and all of that. How did Gingrich change the culture of the House of Representatives as Speaker?
Well, pretty dramatically. So I'd say Gingrich's major argument, simplified, is that partisanship trumps everything else. Meaning those other principles we discussed earlier of governance, of maintaining the institutions, those go by the wayside. That for Republicans to win, they went partisan. They always thought that partisan calculation was most important. And it was a partisanship without guardrails. You could do anything to your opponent. You could get as close to the line as possible in terms of your attacks, and that was okay. He always would speak privately, forget bipartisanship, forget civility. Be aggressive, be ruthless with your opponent, and use every mechanism available, whether it was TV, whether it was ethics rules, whether it was the budget, to your advantage. That's how Republicans were going to get power. And I'm going to get to 94 in a second, but I think 89 is important because Speaker Wright resigns in May of 89, and that's the first time he delivers. He is doing something that is seen as toxic, but he brought down the speaker. And for a lot of Republicans, even the remaining moderates, the Olympia Snows of the party, there was something there in terms of his ability to deliver. 94 is the next stage. He's now the House Minority whip. He's basically pressured Bob Michael to resign. Michael, in one of those moments in political history where your timing is off, has announced he's going to resign right before Republicans finally become the majority party. He would have been Speaker of the House, but Gingrich has gone after him systematically and undermined his support in the caucus. And Republicans take over in '94 with the contract with America, with the attacks on Bill Clinton. And like with Wright, Gingrich delivered. This was his promise from day one. If you let me do whatever I need to do, you won't be a minority party anymore. And so he becomes Speaker, and he doesn't change his ways. This is obviously reminiscent of discussions people have today about whether President Trump will become presidential. He doesn't become an institutionalist as Speaker. He moves forward with everything he had been doing. He continues to encourage the new Republican majority to practice this style of Gingrich politics. He centralizes power in the speakership. He gets rid of the staff that committee used to have, a lot of the staff. He weakens the power of committee chairs by making them people who are not getting their jobs because of seniority, but because they're loyal to him. And obviously with Bill Clinton, President Clinton, he finds his new Jim Wright. This is the next person he's going to take down at a much grander level. And I think as that becomes the capstone in some ways, or the ultimate failure of his term, he makes this kind of smash mouth politics the mode of operation for the Republican Party. And I'd say because of the way he acts, and this becomes clear when you talk with other legislators, a kind of toxic atmosphere is brewing on Capitol Hill that goes well beyond normal partisanship. Where members really are finding relationships severed because of the things that Gingrich is saying are okay to do in the name of partisan war.
It's 6:37. I think I have time to ask maybe 2 or 3 more questions before we flip it out to the audience. Well, first to Kai and Thad, and then to the audience. So let's just hit his downfall, which was 1998. And I'm sure a lot of people know the basic outlines of this story. He's attacking Bill Clinton's morality, even while he is behaving in a morally questionable way himself. Why don't you elaborate on that? But then talk about what happened in that election of '98 and why it was his undoing.
Yeah, so the great thing when you write about someone through a biography or a kind of biography is that you see some of the weaknesses that will ultimately lead to their downfall there all along. So at a personal level, Gingrich never lived a very pristine life. He was constantly in different kinds of personal trouble. His first marriage ends and becomes a very public spectacle, and that someone writes an article about it in Mother Jones saying not only did he, according to the article, serve his wife with divorce papers while she was in the hospital recovering from cancer surgery, but also that he had many affairs and he slept around, and that he did have many affairs. And one of those affairs was happening in 1998 as the Republicans were going after Bill Clinton for perjuring himself about an affair. So at some level, before the midterms, Republicans understood that Gingrich was a flawed leader for this particular cause. And then the midterms don't go particularly well for Republicans in 1998, which is a time you expect Republicans to increase their numbers, or Republicans were hoping to increase their numbers because the president was being impeached as this was going on, but they don't do that. And voters are supporting President Clinton, and Democrats do quite well. And so in a post-Gingrich world, if the speaker isn't delivering, you can bring down the speaker. So he created a world where this was possible. And so they pressure him into resigning. And that's exactly what he does. And he'll step down, almost replaced by a guy named Bob Livingston of Louisiana. But he can't take the job because of his own personal relations. And so finally, a more upstanding legislator, Denny Hastert, takes over and becomes speaker, probably the most notorious of all the personal records.
Family values straight through.
Right.
I'm going to skip ahead to today and ask you this question. So the 6th District of Georgia, Newt Gingrich's district for all those years and a Republican district for many, many years, is now represented by a Democrat, a woman, an African-American woman at that, Lucy McBath, in her first term. What does that say about these suburban counties, Cobb and Gwinnett counties in Atlanta, and the way times have changed? Of course, it says that 2018 was a particularly good Democratic year, but beyond that, what does it say that his district is now represented by a Black woman who's a Democrat?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when the midterms happened. It's really interesting. It's in some ways reminiscent of what was going on in the early 70s when Flint was caught off guard as there was a redistricting that happens, and his district is just changing Flint back in 74 and 76 pretty dramatically. It's these suburbs that are popping up where his constituency used to be rural, and these new conservative elements of the Republican Party were appealing to voters who traditionally would have gone his way. And there was just a totally new focus on issues he had not dealt with, and his own party's changing. All the changes in Georgia we talked about then were really important to why a window opens for someone like Newt Gingrich. And you can see some of that now in that district and in other districts, both in Georgia and in places like Texas, where the demographic changes are just dramatically at odds with where that Gingrich generation of Republicans were. And, Gingrich, his predecessors moved even further to the right on issues like immigration, and they're at odds with a much more diverse constituency that's taken form in these districts. They're at odds with the kind of changes in family and gender dynamics at the workplace that have emerged. That district doesn't sit well, as many districts don't sit well anymore, with this previous era. And I think it makes Republicans vulnerable. You either change or you lose. And I think Republicans are in a place where they might lose a lot more. 2018 could just be a start.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, I'm ready to yield. Kai Bird or Thad Zolkowski, who's sort of doing all the camera work here. Do you guys want to ask questions? Or shall I go to the audience? Well, we can't have silence, so I guess I'll go to the audience. Okay, here's one. Please connect Gingrich to Bannon. That would be Steve Bannon, of course. He's a Southern politician. Did he use the race card in his rise?
Okay, well, there's two parts of Bannon. So race, this is the one question that Gingrich...
I sort of misread these questions kind of got messed up on my screen, but just, answered, it's close enough.
I'll answer two different ways. With race, yeah. I think, Gingrich doesn't explicitly talk about race. He's part of this post-Nixon era where many members of the party are playing on white backlash politics, whether they're trying to connect welfare to African-American communities and the problems that this system creates, or whether they're attacking civil rights. He was pretty careful often to at least rhetorically separate himself from those elements, even though he was helping to create a party that allowed them in the door. His first person he attacks is though, a congressman from Detroit, Charlie Diggs, who's one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus and a prominent figure in the civil rights community. And in '79, this is who Gingrich goes after. Diggs is under investigation for receiving kickbacks from staffers. And usually a party, the Democrats, would handle what to do with this as the investigation's going on. Gingrich goes right after him, and he's making speeches. He shouldn't be allowed to vote. He shouldn't be allowed to participate. And some Republicans privately warn Gingrich, this doesn't look so good, that your first hit, so to speak, is going to be on an African-American legislator. He doesn't care. He privately says, I'm not racist. I'll go after white politicians too. This is who I'm going to focus on. But what his intentions are, I can't really tell you, but he is part of a Republican cohort that is playing on those white backlash themes during the 1980s. In terms of Bannon, there's another element that's a little different in that Bannon really is also articulating Gingrich kinds of themes. He's really into the chaos. He's into the disruption of the political process, and he sees these as valuable tools for Republican Party politics. This is what he did in 2016. And like Gingrich, he understood you could throw a lot of chaos into the media. You could create tumultuous events and debates, and it's hard for the media to take its gaze away from that. And that's fundamentally what Gingrich did. And so I think there's a lot of similarity. And I'll say that when Gingrich ran in 2012 for the presidency unsuccessfully, his advisor was Kellyanne Conway. So there's some direct connections between these two universes that came out in the 2010.
Yeah, I see now these questions about race and about Bannon were in fact from Kai and Thad. I thought they were going to pop back up on our screens, but they asked them that way. Just to follow up on race a little bit, because we don't want to soft pedal this. I mean, he played the race card really hard in his career. And that thing about Susan Smith, the mother in South Carolina, and drowning her kids and some other stories like that. And at the time of Atwater and the time of the Willie Horton stuff, I mean, he was second to none in that category, wouldn't you say?
I would say the difference is Lee Atwater has this famous interview where he talks about the ways that Republicans spoke about these issues in coded ways, and not directly, but in ways that if you were listening, you understood. I did an interview with Jim Carville, who said if you're growing up in the South, you knew exactly what they were talking about. It wasn't very subtle what a lot of Republican rhetoric was about, but they still had that constraint. I would put Gingrich in that era. Lee Atwater was often more explicit in what he was doing. As his career progresses in the 1990s and post-speakership, I think he's been more explicit in using this. Part of what's happened is his party's become more explicit in just using race. And President Trump is kind of the end game in which you just say it. You say it all out loud. And so, but that issue is at the heart of the post-1960s Republican Party. I don't think you can disconnect it. There's a great book. I'll plug another book. It's not mine, but Stuart Stevens, the former Republican consultant of presidential campaigns, has a book coming out where he has an op-ed today, I think in the Times, where this is what he's saying. It's a confessional story. This has always been integral to Republican politics. So no need to soft kind of pedal it. It's just about how he uses it relative to where we are today.
We have 7 or so questions so far from people watching. John asks, can you make links between Gingrich and the rise of the religious right?
Yes, absolutely. The coalition in the 80s for students of the conservative movement is built, a lot of it, around the religious right. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, which take form formally in 1979, or are essential to the coalition that brings Reagan into office, that creates the modern Republican Party. It's still in the 70s and 80s, a very grassroots-based movement where preachers are tapping into elements of these new constituents through the church or through televangelical TV shows, televangelists. And, Gingrich, like Ronald Reagan, doesn't sit well personally with what the religious right is arguing. He's living a life that's at odds with everything they're claiming is important, but he is an instrument for them to achieve power. And as speaker, he has a very close relationship with Reed, who's a key link between the Republican Party, Ralph Reed, the Republican Party, and this religious right. And so during the course of his career, not only does the religious right become more important to Republican politics, they institutionalize themselves. They become a lobby, really perfect their methods to the point where court appointments are often crafted around what they want.
Here's a question. There are a few questions tying the period we're talking about to today. Do you see the feud between Bob Michel and Newt Gingrich as analogous to establishment Republicans like Kevin McCarthy folding to Freedom Caucus Trump supporters like Jim Jordan?
To some extent. In the 80s, I think there was still more of a disconnect between what someone like Bob Michael and Newt Gingrich were about. My book is, though, why the leadership ultimately says, okay, let's let him in the doors. Let's let him have power. And so in the 80s, it's still very much a story of those party leaders who were different, letting him in and saying, for the purposes of finally winning, we're going to let him do his work. We're going to let him do what he wants to do. They still thought they could contain him. They still thought in the end the system could be kept whole. I think today we're in a place where the division still exists. Speaker Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House, he did a little of this. He said, I'm going to let the Tea Party in and I'm going to be able to control them. And later in interviews, he said, he calls Jim Jordan, I think, a legislative terrorist. The difference is I think the leadership today is still pretty extreme, and they are too very to the right. And so it's not much of a difference anymore, where in my period, you see how this relationship is just starting to form.
Yeah. Oh, here's a tantalizing question from Lion. What is the fundamental psychological foundation for Gingrich's behavior?
Shamelessness. I mean, I think this is really important, and it was interesting to watch this as I'm studying him. He is someone who it's hard to get at him because he doesn't care what comes his way. He has this ability to always explain why he is correct and you are wrong, and he has almost a shield when scandal went his way to the feelings that often hurt other politicians. And so in the middle of my story, at the height of the story, as he's attacking Jim Wright for the book deal and for basically unethically selling a book, he argued, he is under investigation for unethically promoting a book by raising money from interest groups to promote it. Interest groups that had business in Atlanta, that had business in his district. And he has to do a press conference. He does one with his wife. He does one by himself to talk about this. And he doesn't care. He just says it's different, not the same, end of story. And this is very much his demeanor. The Mother Jones story came out and he just moved forward. These kinds of issues don't seem to bother him, at least in how he operates. And I think this is essential. And he's willing to say anything. I mean, that is a certain psychology in politics. A lot of politicians won't do that. There is a check in the end. He doesn't have that. He will go very far in what he's willing to say. And you see that now as he often defends President Trump in really the most outlandish or terrible parts of the Trump record. He's first in line to defend it. And he'll spin a very elaborate argument usually about why this is an important moment instead of a terrible moment. And I think that's how he thinks of politics.
Yeah. What was the recent thing? Oh, it was when Trump went to the church with the Bible and Gingrich said, this is the greatest presidential moment. Didn't he? He said something like that.
There was the Mount Rushmore speech. He said that.
Right.
And then he even said it with the interview on Fox News with Chris Wallace. It was actually a great interview.
Oh, yes. Right. Okay, here's a question that people on the left and right debate all the time from Elizabeth. Did Gingrich's attack style spill over to the Democrats as well?
It spills over, but it doesn't transform the party. I'm one of the believers of what journalists and political scientists talk about, asymmetric partisanship. That yes, there's more partisanship in Washington for sure. Yes, you have more Democrats who are comfortable in a kind of very partisan mindset, but the parties are different. And the story of the Republican Party since the 80s is a party that on policy moves as a whole much further to the right than Democrats as a whole move to the left. The Democrats are much more divided on basic questions for the party. And in terms of the partisanship, it's not the same. I think the Republican leadership from Gingrich to Trump embraces a smash-mouth partisanship that not all Democrats and most Democratic leaders are still not comfortable with. You know, I think of Senator Schumer compared to Senator McConnell. There's some fundamental differences in what they're willing to do. And so the parties are different, and that's not, I say to people, a partisan thing to say. It's actually trying to understand how and why the parties look so different in 2020. They haven't evolved the same way. So Gingrich became the leader. And those parts of the Democratic Party that might replicate some of what he does, they have never captured the leadership. Speaker Pelosi is not a Gingrich Democrat at all. And she's still very much more an institutionalist and coalition builder within her party, to the frustration of many progressives.
The political science that you and I read when we were undergraduates described parties having a certain kind of behavior, whether they were parties of the left or right, whether they were in our kind of system or parliamentary system. All parties exhibited certain traits. That's not really true anymore.
I think that's right. And it is when I was in college and reading about partisanship emerging, that's exactly right. And I think it's been an important development to understand that. Ironically, I think it's the Tea Party and then President Trump who have given room for that conversation, because what you see is so extreme, whether it was the Tea Party refusing to raise the debt ceiling and threatening to send us all into default over budget disputes, or whether it's President Trump doing whatever he does on a daily basis. And I think that's the only way to understand political history of the period since the 1980s. It's actually a mistake to do it the way we learned it. Maybe at the time that was inaccurate, but that's not how it evolved. And then you're just not understanding American politics. You're getting a skewed vision. And then for today, it obviously has big implications about why things are happening.
Here's a question from Anna, whom I know, I believe, by the way. Hi, Anna. You mentioned shamelessness. What's the antidote to shamelessness? How does an opponent combat it effectively?
That's very hard, and that's the $1 million question for a lot of Democrats. And it's, do you go there? Do you end up in the end having to embrace those tactics? I'm not sure Democrats will, because of what we're talking about, and because the cost of the partisanship that Gingrich through Trump employ is to really make governance dysfunctional and ultimately to create a system that's almost useless. Not useless, but it's very hard to use it in response to something like a pandemic. And Democrats believe in government. Progressives, moderates, they believe in government. So they're not going to respond the same way. They're always going to have a little bit of a check in terms of, do we really want to do that? But there are ways to respond. Look, I think Democrats historically have not been very good in terms of their media and how they respond to attacks and how they launch attacks through the media of the moment. That was true of Jim Wright. I would argue it's still true today. It's not a surprise. Probably the best ads about Donald Trump are coming from a group of Republicans through the Lincoln Project, not from the Biden campaign. So you can do that. You can speak more clearly to an opponent that's doing that about what they're doing. You can be clear without being kind of lowball politics about what is a politician doing? What are they about? Are they playing to elements of the electorate that care about racism? And you could talk with a kind of honesty that sometimes Democrats are a little bit scared of doing. Those are just two examples of where you don't have to become a Gingrich politician to push back against it.
Here's a question that always stumps me when I'm asked it from Jim. Who are some Republicans you find interesting right now?
Who are some Republicans I find interesting? I'm stumped. I'm with you. It's hard. I mean, look. Well, I can answer it a different way. I find Mitch McConnell interesting. If the question is good versus bad, that's one question. In terms of an interesting legislator, he is a perfectionist of what Gingrich argued in terms of the way he uses the basic processes of government as a partisan bludgeon. No one does it like him. He has the shamelessness in some ways to take every element of his job and use it to preserve his majority. And that's pretty interesting to watch in practice. Again, not good or bad, but I think he's a very relevant player. And he also does that equation we talked about with Gingrich and his ability to always see the partisan objective, no matter what's coming at him in the media, no matter any heat that the party is facing, he sticks to this. And for that reason, I think he's a key player. And so it's interesting. That's one word to follow what he does.
Here's an interesting question from Raj. Did any groups of Republicans leave the party because of Gingrich?
Did any groups leave the party? That's a good question. I can't think of someone. I mean, when he wins, for example, House Minority Whip, people are pretty happy. Olympia Snow is one of the people who cast the deciding vote. And she is not a Gingrich Republican, but she says this guy is a visionary. And no one's defecting because of that. When he becomes speaker in 94, I can't think of someone who voluntarily says, I'm out of this party. And now I don't know if you've seen a few Republicans who leave saying at least they don't like what this party is about. It's hard to distinguish between Republicans who might have lost anyway, or it's just seeing that they can't win in the party as opposed to disliking it. But we'll see. That's the $1 million question. They haven't left Trump yet. Right. And if it's a Gingrich-Trump era, I guess in 2020 we'll have a better answer. But I can't think of many Republicans who left because of Gingrich.
That was a period, in fact, when, if anything, Democrats were switching to Republican. The most high-profile case at the time, of course, was Richard Shelby, the Alabama senator, who's still there and who was a Democrat, elected originally in 84 or 86, became a Republican after the 94 election. But from the level of the Senate on down to state houses, hundreds of Democrats switched to Republican.
And it was important. It's important to remember, this is why Gingrich was this huge figure in the party. The 90s was an exciting era for Republicans. Even if the impeachment of Bill Clinton ended up backfiring, for many of them, this is chapter 2 of the Reagan Revolution. Reagan brought conservatism to the White House, and he brought this new Republican Party into power. And that's what Gingrich and his allies, Trent Lott and others, did for the GOP on Capitol Hill. And it was quite important. And it changes the Clinton presidency even on policy. And it's continued through this day to be a base of conservative power. Even if they've lost control at certain moments like today, I think that 90s wasn't about Republicans in trouble. It was about Democrats are in trouble, and that's why they were the ones flipping.
Yeah. Let's start winding down. I'm sure people want to hear you talk about today's political situation, which we touched on a little bit. Let's glide into that topic by specifically talking about Gingrich. So Judy asks what role Gingrich will play in this election. He's a talking head on Fox, of course, but anything beyond that, and what even in that role, what is his importance?
Well, he plays a role automatically, and that this is a party he's one of the founders of, and so every time you see President Trump say what we've seen some of, I think we're only seeing a taste of what he's going to say about Biden and other Democrats. He's speaking like Newt, to use a line from a memo that Newt put out. He's using language once considered marginal as normal. So his shadow hangs over the election. It is why President Trump can do all this. And most of the Republican Party isn't actually going to leave. They're going to stay in place, or at best, if you're a Democrat, they won't vote. But that's one role he plays. And a second is he'll be a talking head in the conservative ecosystem, media ecosystem, which is quite important. He is a statesman of the party. He's the senior statesman, not the Bush family. And I imagine he'll continue to try to give legitimacy and rationale to everything Trump does to conservative voters and maybe to some independent voters. And that's important for Trump to have, because how outlandish he is willing to be. And I wouldn't be surprised if he advises and possibly is named, as a possible pick for a future cabinet in term 2. He's always been part of the Trump orbit. He's written several books about why Trump's a great president. He just has a new one out recently. And so I think important in Trump world.
Well, he's got a nice free apartment in Rome too, as a result of President
true.
Trump. I don't know how much time he spends there.
Yeah, right.
So then, just moving away from Newt, I'm sure people just want to hear your thoughts on the election and where you believe we are right now, and where you believe we're headed, and what you think people ought to be concerned about, maybe not be concerned about. Just general lay of the land, general landscape, if you will.
Yeah, sure. I think I won't give prognostications because I don't know. Biden's doing well, but things can change. So I can put that one aside. I think we're in a bad place. I do. As a historian who studies just this country, certainly 20th and 21st century, watching the pandemic unfold and living it has really been the clearest evidence. I didn't need this piece of evidence, but it's been clear about our inability and failure to govern through the challenges we face as a country. And right now, I think it's hard not to pin a lot of this, the response to the COVID virus, to the White House, to the Republican Senate, and to many red state governors who are defying science, who are spreading disinformation, who are acting for what in the short term seems very appealing for their partisan goals, meaning just get things reopened and saying everything is normal, to a very destructive level. And I wish I don't wish, but I wish I could say it's an aberration, but it's simply playing out the same problems we've seen with Supreme Court nominations and budgeting. Nothing is working well right now. And it's more than journalists being hysterical, saying, oh my God, there's a problem today. This is a bigger moment we're in American history, where a lot of what conservatism has done has rendered this institution incapable of another New Deal. And we need it desperately. And I don't see the Republican Party is going to change. I'm not a believer in that. The point of my book and some others is this is deeply cooked into the party. And if a Joe Biden wins, the kind of tone and atmosphere of Washington will be just as bad, unless it's so destructive, Trump's presidency, that Republicans shrink to insignificance in the Senate and in state government. So I see a lot of bad as a historian, for sure. And I think the destructive elements of the Trump presidency are very real in terms of what he's doing. On the good side, I think the protests that we've seen, from the Women's March to the kind of protests about policing and race, have shown that there are also important elements of our democratic system that are alive and well. And that even in the worst of times, even in the moments that should be absolutely disheartening, in terms of answering the question, why participate, there's still many Americans who have a good answer to that, and they will do it. And I'm hoping that element of politics, and that element can come out in any party, but that it's still part of our system. My biggest concern is voting. And I guess I could end with this, that I really think we have a problem on our hands between voting restrictions being so prevalent in many states in the last 2 decades, combined with a pandemic that is literally making voting a risk and probably will make it a risk come November. We have a basic problem on our hands about whether most Americans are going to be able to cast a ballot. And that's an unacceptable problem. And I very much worry what November is going to look like, because we're basically not setting up to have a good response in all states. Yep.
Well, not an optimistic note, but one for us to think about as we end. This is the book. That's the cover. Burning Down the House. It's terrific. And Julian, this has been great.
Thanks so much for great questions. And thanks to everyone, Kai and everyone, Thad, and everyone who did this. It's been a terrific evening. And thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Levy Center. And good night, everybody.
Good night.